Ready.
I get confused by any language where they they repeat the letters endlessly, or they put two U's with two dots over them, and things such as that. So how do I pronounce this exactly? Astrid I can handle, but is it Kirchherr? Astrid Kirchherr?
I think it's just. I think it's just Kircher. Kircher. I think it's Kircher.
Kind of like Don Kirshner, but without the N. Okay.
Right.
Kirchherr.
Yep. You don't have to say no.
All right.
But it's hard to spell on a computer.
Yes, it is. I agree. Wants to correct you.
Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown of the Beatles Kingdom. Our extra special guest tonight, a repeat guest, that means she comes on all the time, Dr. Kit O'Toole, who will help us remember Astrid Kirchherr, Stuart Sutcliffe, and the Beatles in Hamburg. But first, a word from our sponsor. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 370 plus million visitors in all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world every day. Beatles news is updated daily, 24 hours, audio, video, photos, interviews, contests, additional materials, and more. Follow Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day, and here's the big part to sell. And how many days a week, people?
8 days a week.
All right, we even got the finger counting. I like that. We never had that before.
Well, at least she gave you the right finger, Bob.
She's given me the other one at other times, but I'm not. But, Dr. Kit, what pops into your mind, and you helped me pronounce her name before the show started, so I didn't say Kirchherr, but what pops into your mind when you first think of Astrid Kirchherr? Tell us a bit about who she is and how she fit in with the Beatles.
Well, first of all, Bob and Warren, thank you so much for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to be with you both. And thank you so much. Of course, thank you. And of course, I'm sorry though that it has to be for this occasion because Astrid, this is a big loss for the Beatles community because Astrid was a huge part of the Beatles story, particularly in the early years. She met the Beatles in Hamburg when they were playing there in 1960. She was an artist. She was specifically a photographer. And she and other names you will all know, Klaus Vormann, and Jurgen Vollmer, yes. They were all art students and all friends. And in fact, Astrid and Klaus were also dating at the time. And they were all, living in Hamburg. And one fateful night in October 1960, Klaus and Astrid had a big fight. And Klaus stormed off and needed to get some air, must have been a big fight, and found himself in the Reeperbahn. Now, as we all know, I'm sure we've all read, it was not a great area, to say the least. It was a pretty rough area. But he found himself at the Kaiser. And of course, that was one of the clubs that the Beatles played. And he heard this noise, coming from the club. And he came in, and there were the Beatles playing there, and he was just, enthralled. And he just, was just absolutely entranced by the sound of this band and their charisma. So he came back to the apartment and said to Astrid and later to Jurgen, said, "You've got to see this band at the Kaiserkeller. They're incredible." And so, they first thought, "What are you talking about?" And then, because they actually were not rock and roll fans, believe it or not, none of them were at this point. They were all art students. They were all, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but they were known as egsies, which were basically, they were kind of what I guess you would call beatniks. They were sort of the artsy bohemian kind of students of that time. They were listening to jazz and classical, so they weren't rock and rollers. But Klaus said, "You've got to see these guys." So they came, and of course, as we all know, they also just fell under the spell of the Beatles, and Astrid specifically fell under the spell of Stu Sutcliffe. And we all know that they fell madly in love, and she ended up playing a major part in their early development. We'll be talking specifically about some of the ways, but she, I think, really brought an artistic kind of sensibility to them. I mean, that they would carry throughout their entire career. I mean, they were their first kind of intellectual fans and really introduced them to a world of art that maybe John Lennon had seen before, because of course he had been in art school, but really introduced them to a world and introduced them to what it, to style, that your look is as important as your music. And, overall, I think of her as just, elegant, independent, unique, and ahead of her time. She really was. When you saw her throughout her life, she just had this timeless look about her. She just always looked thoroughly modern. And so I just think she was such a unique woman. And it's just such a sad day that, to find out that we've lost, another major part of Beatles history.
You talked about Stuart Sutcliffe, and something really stands out in my mind about him. Like I asked you in the past, like John and Paul had kind of a unique relationship. They were close, but it seemed to be more competitive. But it seems like Stuart Sutcliffe, in a way, I see a closeness comes through in the photos, where it seems that he seems closer or more open to him with his body language and such than I saw even with the Beatles. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, they really did seem to have a special bond, didn't they? I mean, they met in art school in Liverpool, and they just had an instant connection. And it's in fact, Paul admitted in later years that he was really jealous of the close friendship that they had. I think it was their mutual interest in art. And it began, I think, that Stu kind of helped John through school. I think he, helped John study for tests and gave him pointers with artwork and everything. And I think John, greatly admired him. And I think, not only for his artwork, but I mean, Stu was just cool. I mean, you can just tell by his pictures. I mean, he just had this James Dean thing going on. I mean, he really just had a great look. But I think, Stu maybe admired John. I don't mean to, I wasn't there. I don't mean to overanalyze here, but I think, Stuart probably appreciated his humor. And I think they were both very, fiercely individual people, that I think Stu was such a talented artist and was kind of a rebel in that sense. John, as we know, was certainly a rebel. I think that's a fair statement to say. And so I think they just naturally kind of gravitated toward each other in that way. And I think so. I think it was just their mutual love of art, and just the way that they were both just determined to be, just unique individual people to forge their own paths. And maybe they weren't intentionally thinking that when they first met, but I think that's probably what drew the two together, and probably then what drew Astrid and Stu together as well. But yeah, they definitely had a special bond that Paul and John just didn't quite have. They were close friends, they were, but yeah, it was like John and Stu were like on another level of friendship. I mean, they really had a tight bond.
Well, your analysis is like very insightful, so never be afraid to give your analysis. It's what butters the biscuits, if you know what I'm saying. So,
thank you.
But I think that you hit the nail on the head there. Before you brought up the German art students, John Lennon called them Axes. So there's some, John Paul Sartre. I had a little joke: John Paul, George, and Ringo Sartre. But just wondering a little bit about that, if you could expound on these existentialists.
Well, it's from what I could research. It was a movement that came in Europe, and particularly Germany, after World War II. After World War II, obviously, it was devastating to Europe in many ways, and particularly to Germany. And German youths, in particular, were kind of looking to get away from the traditional model of being German. I mean, I saw saw an interview with Astrid, and I think it was in 2010 that she taught with NPR, that she was talking about this, that, let's just say, obviously, image of Germans after World War II, was not the greatest, shall we say. And so Germans were looking to France, particularly. They really liked the French image. And that's where, Jean-Paul Sartre comes in, and they loved that image of the French philosophy. They loved to listen to jazz. They loved to listen to, to classical music. And so they were kind of sort of the hipsters of their time. And in fact, I found a little quote here from Paul McCartney, saying he described them as being as bridging mod and rocker style. They weren't really rockers or mods like we'd seen. They were something in the middle. They were art students. So they were just kind of looking to break from their parents' generation, and they were just kind of looking for something new, and to just break away from previous thought, previous philosophy. And after World War II, I hate to make it sound like existentialism was the rage, but it kind of was. And so it crossed over also into art, into music, into literature. And so Astrid, Klaus, Jurgen Vollmer, they were all kind of following this. And so they were kind of, as I said, the beatniks in a way, of that era. And the Beatles really hadn't seen anything like that until they came to Hamburg.
So basically, bongos and berets were going to rehabilitate the image from being fascist. I kid. But kind of, yeah. I mean, that sounds kind of funny, but I mean, kind of, yeah. I mean, they were looking to break away. I mean, they wanted to get away from World War II. They wanted to get away from that image. They wanted to break away from, their parents and a generation, and they wanted to just, be like the opposite of that. And so, I mean, that's kind of it.
And so that's when they, started, and it was John, that nicknamed them the Egsies. But that's, but yeah, they were following this existential kind of thought, and specifically Sartre, as you mentioned. So, yeah, it was kind of fascinating, and it was sort of unique to Germany, and they were basically copying what the French were doing specifically.
It's funny when they talk about the Beatles, they always go to the Kennedy assassination and they say we needed relief from that. I'm sure there's some truth in that, but it's almost like people are afraid to talk about what happened in Germany. As much as the Kennedy assassination, I believe the nation needed some relief. I mean, how much more like what was held in and repressed and such after what happened with World War II, it's still being sorted out, and as we look back on it. But I think that's something people are sort of afraid to mention. But I'll just go into, if you want to comment on that part, you can, but you already kind of did. But
well, no, it's true, and it's really interesting because I was watching Anthology recently in preparation for another podcast I'm going to be on, where we're discussing about the TV version of Anthology, and a little bit about the the sort of the hype that was around it at the time and everything. And it was interesting, talking when they were talking about the births of each of the Beatles, and and that it was during World War II or right after World War II, and how they were, living in the aftermath of it, and how much, it really, the aftermath of World War II really hung over Britain for so long. And, and how it really just was like a shadow over the country for such a long time. And Germany was no exception. That's for sure.
I think it's also kind of strange, as you were talking, it dawned on me Hitler had been an artist, which was how he started out, which is quite a transition.
Yeah, right.
But that's going to be an episode on Talk More Talk that's upcoming on the Talk More Talk show.
Sure, maybe. but
about the anthology. When you said anthology, where my mind goes.
Yes.
That's all right, Mama. Short version. Sorry, but I won't go there.
That's right.
But who is this Jurgen Vollmer character who also hung out with them?
Well, Jurgen was kind of interesting. He was also a photographer, and he, was good friends with Klaus and Astrid, and he ended up taking some pretty famous shots of the Beatles as well. But the one that's most iconic, of course, is the one that ended up on the John Lennon Rock and Roll album cover. That great shot of him leaning in a doorway in Hamburg, which is a great moody kind of shot. And in fact, a lot of photos he took of them had that kind of moody quality. And John specifically said he really liked the photos that he took of the Beatles. A lot of them were on stage, and they are great photos of them, performing really kind of these raw, rough kind of looking shots of them in the leather and everything. And then he did go on to become, a photographer. I think he went on to move to Hollywood and took a lot of photos there of celebrities and everything. But he really became, I think, best known for his shots of the Beatles, and specifically that one of John. I mean, people still, when they go to Hamburg, they have to pose there in that doorway. Everybody does it. But he was part of this, he was an Eggsy. He was part of that scene. And he went to the Kaiser Keller as well, and he took a lot of those photos. And John said he felt he really captured he was a great rock and roll photographer, that he really captured the wild spirit of the Beatles. And maybe that's true, because I think Astrid's photos were a little more introspective. They capture, I think in her photos, they looked a little more vulnerable, whereas in Jurgen's photos, they were a little tougher looking, perhaps. So yeah, he was an interesting character too.
I think that's very true what you said about the different styles in the photos. I think after Abbey Road, that doorway is the most posable place that you could go on a Beatles tour and take a picture. But I hand over to Warren.
Hello, Kit, and thank you for coming back on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And I enjoy every minute of it, and I learn something new every time I talk to you.
Oh, thanks, Warren. I appreciate it.
Well, with all this sad news being said today about Astrid, I got some good news today on Facebook. You posted something on Facebook about your mom. How is she doing? And can you let everybody know that, please?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. Yep, I'm really thrilled to say she is doing a lot better. Our doctor figured out that there was this ongoing issue she was having with appetite and so forth, that it was a reaction to an antibiotic that she had received in the hospital that was giving her ongoing issues. So he gave her medicine to counteract that, and the turnaround has been amazing. It is really just amazing. So she's
good news.
Oh, she's doing
that's
so
much
awesome
better to hear, and I figured all your fans would love to hear that.
Oh,
so that's why I asked.
Thank you so much. So yep, so she's doing much better, and she's getting better every day. So thanks so much for asking. And so, the power of prayers and good thoughts and everything, it works.
And that's great. Good to hear.
Thank you.
Okay, now I'll get back onto the sad subject, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I'm glad your mom's doing good.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but Astrid dated Klaus Vollmer, and then they were friends after Stuart came onto the scene. Can you go into that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that amazing that they were able to stay friends for the rest of their lives? There really didn't seem to be any hard feelings. I mean, from everything I've read and from things that Astrid said in interviews, that I guess once they saw each other, that night at the Kaiser Keller, she and Stuart, that was it. I mean, they just had an instant connection. And somehow Klaus seemed to understand, and he, and not long after that, Astrid and Klaus, they became strictly platonic, and it's just, and really, I've never heard that Klaus was mad. I never heard anything like that. And in fact, whenever Klaus talked about her at any of like the Fest for Beatles fans, he just seemed nothing but fond of her. I mean, it was really, and same thing with Astrid. It was really, I just think Klaus seemed to understand that, she and Stu just had just an undeniable special connection. And he just seemed to say, okay, I'm getting out of the way. And yeah.
It sounds like a familiar story, like with George Harrison, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because you would think, that's a very good point. Because, I mean, I remember, the famous quote that when Eric Clapton, said to George, I'm in love with your wife and all that. I think George said something like, well, I'd rather her be with you than some jerk, or something like that. I'm like, boy, that's really understanding. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So I mean, I think it was kind of like that, but in this case, I think it was that Klaus just seemed to understand that, okay, that Astrid and Stu just have a special connection, and I'm just getting out of the way. And they absolutely, as I said, they remained friends the rest of their lives. Never heard them say a bad word about each other. They kept in touch, which I just think, wow, that's pretty amazing. And they just they had a special relationship themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, since I mentioned George, I want to stick with him for a minute. Did Astrid design George's Wonderwall album?
Actually, she took the photo of him. That's I think on it's the sleeve, the inner sleeve of the album, and it was kind of a fluke, from what I understand, that she was in London, and George, found out, and because they remained close throughout their lives. In fact, to digress for just a second, just before we started recording this, I saw that Olivia Harrison issued a statement on the George Harrison Twitter account, saying that how close she was to the Harrison family, and that George would, just loved her his whole life. I mean, just that they were such good friends and everything. So clearly, she and George remained very close. But anyway, so he, I guess, she was in London, and he called her up and said, hey, could you come and take a picture of me? I'm coming out with this album. And so she did, and that was one of her real talents. She could really take great portraits. And she said that, that was really her interest. She loved taking portraits. And so that wonderful picture of him, it's very simple. But again, I think she just had a great talent for taking these photos of people and really getting to the, really making them seem vulnerable. I mean, getting past any kind of tough exterior or anything. It was just this very kind of introspective portrait of him. And so that was really her role in the Wonderwall album. It was that portrait. That's it. Which, as I said, I think it's the sleeve for the LP, and it's really beautiful, and it just shows you how they never forgot her, and continue to have her involved in their projects as much as they could.
Mm-hmm. Well, she was a great photographer, and I believe some of her works are in museums. What type of photographic legacy has Astrid left behind?
Well, one of the things I think that's important to remember is that, and unfortunately, it's a reason why she retired early, which she stopped taking pictures in fact, that photo we just talked about with Wonderwall, that's one of the last she took. She said that it was really hard for a woman to break into the photography business then. She said it was just, and that it was hard to get people to be interested in her work besides the Beatles photographs. That's all people wanted from her. And so really, I think that she was a pioneer, that, being, in the early 60s, being a woman photographer. And the work that she did was, so modern, and, just stark. And yet, as I said, in the case of the Beatles, it was stark, but yet she really captured their vulnerability. I just feel like she was so ahead of her time, and it's just a shame. I think if she, had come along maybe 10 years later or so, I think she could have probably had more success as a photographer and as a woman. But it was the wrong time. So I think her legacy will not only be, of course, being tied to the Beatles, that she was the first to, and that influenced their look, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think it's important to also remember, as a woman, that she was kind of a pioneer as a photographer and as an artist, and I think she'd like us to remember her that way too, and not just and not just as, oh, she's one of the first who took photos of the Beatles, that she was also a pioneer in terms of being a female photographer at a time when it was pretty tough to be one.
Right. Well, we talked a little earlier before the show about a few of the photographs she took. And one of my favorites is the one where they're sitting on the trolley car, I believe it is, with the Beatles and Stu and all. Can you go into that photograph a little bit? And where was that taken, you said?
It was on a fairground. She, early on when she met them, she said wisely, she said, I'd love to take your pictures. I'd love to take pictures of you guys. And can I do it? And they said, sure. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
So, so she took, it was her idea. She took them to this fairground that was nearby. Now, I'm not sure if it was abandoned. I mean, it sure kind of looked like it. Or if it was just out of season or something. But she took that picture. I mean, it just showed you she really had a sense of really being able to set a scene. I mean, it's just, that is such an iconic picture.
Yes, it is.
Isn't it? I mean, she just really, recognized what would make a great backdrop. And is it ever? And, just the way the guys are posed. And as I said, they're in the leather, they look kind of tough. But when you really look at them individually, you see that kind of vulnerability that, maybe not as tough as they look. And it's just, it's a classic. And it's I just think it's a brilliant photograph. One of my other favorites too, I mean, it's very sad, but is after Stu died, and the Beatles came back to tour this time, of course. They were on the rise and all, and George and John visited her place, and she took them up to the attic where Stu used to do his paintings, work on his paintings, and they stood where he used to stand, to work on his paintings, and they're just standing there, and I mean, it's this stark, and they're kind of in shadow, and you can just tell how, they were grieving for Stu, particularly John, and it's just an incredible picture of grief, and it's just, I mean, what a powerful photo, and fearless. I mean, a fearless photo to take. And so that's another example, I think, of just incredible work.
Yeah, she took some great iconic photos, and I think the backdrop and the backgrounds were the key to all of them. I think she knew where to take the best photo and how to take it, and I think she was great at that. Very
simple, very simple backdrops. I mean, it was just really like that one. We were talking about this before we started recording, that wonderful, well, I guess you call it a selfie now, but
that's what they call it.
That's what they now, but the one where she's standing in front of the mirror, I love that. And I think we were talking about it, I think it was taken in her bedroom. And she's just staring into the mirror, and it's just such a, it's both, kind of, I don't know, confrontational, but contemplative. And again, very simple. But just it's like you're peering into her soul or something. I mean,
exactly.
It's just a wonderful, wonderful picture. And again, just too bad she.
Yeah, it looks like she was trying to take a picture of her soul. You're exactly
seriously.
Right.
I mean, it really. I mean, the way she's looking right at you, and I mean, it's just a shame that she decided to leave the business so soon, because. As I said, I think if, maybe if, 10 years later, she really could have, done more in the industry. And, but she just decided to retire from it. But, but she's made her mark.
I'm gonna talk about two more pictures, then I'm gonna ask a question, and then I'll hand it back over to the bulldog.
All right.
She's got a picture of when they were in Hamburg, with the Beatles standing in the alley at the alleyway, and it's got the strip club signs on there and the bookmark signs and all on it. That is such a great photo. And I don't know wherever she came up with the idea of taking a picture of them in that alleyway, but I think that's an awesome photo.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, she was, as I said, just so good at coming up with these, sometimes unlikely backdrops.
Right.
Taking something like, an alley or something, where you just think, what's beautiful about that? or like a streetcar or something, and she'd make it work. I mean, it would just yeah.
Yeah, I really love that photo. And there's also one more photo, and it's of Paul McCartney sitting in a chair. He's got his hands on his knees, and she's got several shots of that at different angles and different lighting. And she put them all together in one photo that I think is really, really awesome. Whoever thought to do something like that? She was really good.
Again, just really ahead of her time. And I mean, she was a real artist, and just really just so creative. Just so creative. You can see how she and Stuart connected. I mean, you absolutely can see it.
Right. All right. My question is, did Astrid design the Beatles haircuts?
This has been a question that has been debated for so long, and Astrid herself said she did not make up that style, which I'm sure she didn't. I mean,
Right.
I'm sure she's right. But apparently, she told a story, again, in this NPR interview. Apparently, she said somehow it was actually Klaus who came home, and I don't know if he got this haircut from, a barber or something, but he was self-conscious about his ears.
Wow.
That he said he hated it, like he thought he had big ears or something. And he came home and he had this hair, over his ears. And she said she thought, hey, that's kind of a cool look. I kind of like that hair. She thought it was kind of cute. So
Right.
Stuart saw it and he said, hey, I like that. And said to Astrid, could you cut my hair like that? So she did.
Wow.
So at first, John and all them made fun of him for it. And then eventually I think they decided, you know what, though? It stands out. And, I think what did they call that style? I think they call it the Duck's Arse style or something. The kind of pompadour thing. I think they kind of saw it was on the way out. And
Right.
And so they said, Astrid, could you cut us like that? And so she did, and famously, or maybe infamously, Pete Best wouldn't do it.
Right.
And a lot of people said that may have been a sign of things to come, that he wouldn't do it. So then he kind of stuck out after that. So, she didn't make it up. I mean, I agree with her. I'm sure she didn't. But
Right.
she was the first to, give them the cut. But I would also argue, though, that I think she was an influence on them in terms of not only that, but I think in general, because, Stu started even wearing her clothes because they were basically like the same size. And he would wear, she had collarless jackets, and he started wearing those, and the guys would see him with that and all. And so, because she would dress in a very artsy way, so he would. I think, she was teaching them something about style, and that they needed to stand out, and that style is just as important, as substance. And I mean, substance is very important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, but they needed to make themselves stand out. And while obviously when they met Brian Epstein and he said, you guys have to clean up, you have to get in the suits and everything, I mean, he 100% is credited with that. But I think she was the first to say to them, you have to put a little thought into how you look, and you need to look a little different, to stand out. And that's something that I think they carried with them through their whole careers. So I would, and she studied fashion too, by the way, before she then decided to concentrate on photography. So, I think it can be argued that she can be credited with that, for teaching them a little something about, about style and presentation.
Right. I didn't know she was into fashion before a photographer. So that was good information I haven't heard.
I was when I was doing a little background research on her, she studied fashion and art, and then just decided that photography was more her interest. But that she said she always kind of maintained a little interest in fashion, but that ending up just decided photography was more her interest.
Right. Well, you can tell she did by the photos that she took. That fashion was always a part of it. So
yeah, absolutely.
With that being said, I'm going to hand it off to the Bulldog.
All right.
Thank you, Kit.
Sure.
As time passed and the Beatles became more famous, like you mentioned, like when she was in town, George had her, shoot the album cover. It seemed like they very much thought of this group of people as equals. And even though they might have been nice to other artists at times like that, when the Beatles hit it big like Elvis had, I guess it just goes with the territory to some extent. You're in the business and you're meeting all these people. But they seem to really have a special affection for her in this group in this time period. And John had made that quote, he was exaggerating things at that point, I think, but, about the Beatles were never the same after they left Germany, Hamburg, and such like that. What comes to your mind about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I've always said with John's interviews that it depends where he was at that point in his life as to what he said. I think definitely that was a definite that was a special point in their lives when they were in Hamburg. I mean, they were just learning, and I think meeting this group of people, the Egsies really, taught them a lot. And I'm not just talking about, in Hamburg, I'm not talking about the drugs and sex and all. I mean, yes, that was part of it. Of course it was. But I think they forged, the Beatles, some real friendships there. And it was at a time where, let's face it, when they, then when they hit it big, they, I think they felt like they had to choose their friends more carefully. I mean, like any famous person, you have to be careful of, what they want from you and all. And when they were in Hamburg, they obviously weren't famous yet. And so they, I think, felt that Astrid, Klaus, and Jurgen Vollmer, and all, that these were true friends, and they really stayed in their lives for a long time, because I think they felt they could trust them, that they knew them from back when, and didn't want things from them, and of course they were genuinely talented people. That's the other thing. And so they really, and they taught the Beatles a lot about art, about about fashion. I mean, the list goes on. And I think, as I was saying to Warren, I think they carried those lessons with them for the rest of their lives. And so I think that's why, these figures really, stayed with them for so long and became such big figures in Beatles history too.
Now, with Stuart Sutcliffe's passing, it seemed, it was very abrupt. What effect did that have on John Lennon specifically? And obviously Astrid called Stuart the love of her life. What comes to your mind? And I'm sure most of our audience is well familiar with the story, but you have a way of telling it and you have other insights. So what did you think of all that?
Oh man. Well, of course, Astrid, she did marry twice. After that, once to, I believe he was the drummer for Rory Storm of the Hurricanes. For
Gibson Kemp. I only looked that up today.
Yep, Gibson Kemp, absolutely, and neither marriage lasted, and no kids. Clearly, I think she never got over Stu, and in fact. In that NPR interview I've been mentioning from 2010, she said, he was and still is the love of my life. I never ever, and I was married a couple of times, met another man who was so fascinating, so beautiful, and so soft and well-mannered. You name it, and that's what he was, and such a gifted artist. I mean, she clearly, never got over him. And as far as John goes, I think, I mean, when I say John, I never met him personally and all, but from what I think, what we've read about him, he plays the tough guy. I'm sure I read somewhere he didn't go to his funeral, but I think he was deeply. From everything I've read, he was deeply affected by Stu's death. And as we know, his picture is on the Sgt. Pepper cover. So clearly, John never forgot him. And I think Yoko mentioned, and I can't remember where I read this, but Yoko mentioned somewhere that John used to talk about him all the time. I'm sure that it affected John greatly, but I'm sure he held it inside and didn't talk about it a lot and all that. But I'm sure that it really affected him. And I think I've read in interviews that Paul years later felt kind of guilty about the way he treated Stuart in the band, that he was a little hard on him, and admitted that he was pretty jealous of John and Stu's friendship, and so probably that was part of the reason he was kind of hard on him about his bass playing and all that stuff. So I think there was a bit of guilt there. But with John, I just think he really not only lost a good friend, but as I was talking about earlier, I mean, they were like each other's creative equals in a way, and to lose someone like that, I mean, that's got to affect you.
Well, after he lost so many other people already, how
exactly
at that point, once Stu died, about 21, 22?
Exactly. I mean, losing his mother and I mean, that's really got to affect you. And so I'm sure, even though, I'm sure he put up a front, but I'm sure that it must have been devastating to him.
And you mentioned something before that sticks out in my mind when I look at the photos and hear about those times. It just seemed Pete Best was already out of that loop. Like he just did. I don't see him in the pictures. He doesn't seem to blend in like that. Anything to that, or am I reading into it too much?
Yep, I mean, and in fact, I saw again today, Pete Best issued a statement on Twitter saying, what a wonderful lady she was and all. But yeah, I mean, I read that after they had that photo shoot at the fairgrounds, the famous photo shoot, that she had them all over, invited them all over to her house for dinner, and Pete wouldn't go. And I think that became a pattern. And I don't think it was that he didn't like her or anything. I mean, I don't think it was anything, that personal, but, I don't know if he felt comfortable around the Eggsys and all that. I just don't think it was his scene. And as I mentioned earlier, he didn't get the haircut and all that. And so, yeah, I think it was evident back then that Pete was just kind of not part of the group. He was pulling away even back then. So, I mean, I think it was pretty, evident even back then that, he was not like a real close member of the band. And, so that's the thing. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, that, that she really became like a, kind of a surrogate mother to them in a way, the Beatles. I mean, she would invite them over and do home cooking for them at times. And, so she really, she said she would sometimes, because she said they would live on like beer and, they didn't exactly take wonderful care of themselves. So she would do that too. And so, and may I add one more thing, as I want to make sure I say this, I have an anecdote about her. I will never forget, she came to a fest for Beatles fans. This is at least 20 years ago, probably more. It was probably in the late 90s, something like that. And I think it was the first time she had ever come to one. And I mean, we were excited. I mean, to have Astrid coming. I mean, she was like this, mythical figure. I mean, this, and we just couldn't believe she was coming in person. I mean, we were actually going to see her in person. And I will never forget when she walked on stage to give her talk, and walked into, this was at the Chicago Fest, when she walked onto the stage in the main ballroom, the whole audience, I mean, you could hear a pin drop. I'll never forget it. I've never seen that with any other guest at the fest. I mean, because everybody was just like in awe. I mean, and she walked on the stage and she looked exactly like you would expect her to look. The short hair, like the same hair that she wore in the early 60s. She was in all black and like almost like black Beatle boots, like the Cuban heels. I mean, it was incredible. And then everybody stood up and gave her gave her a huge standing ovation. And she answered everybody's questions, even though that back then they allowed some audience questions, and some people came up to the microphone and asked some pretty cringy questions. I mean, like one asked, "What did Stu smell like?" I'll never forget. Wow. And I wanted to dive under a chair. I mean, I just thought, well, that's it. She'll never come back. But she was gracious. She answered. I mean, she said, "You smelled like paint." I mean, big surprise. And
good answer.
Good answer. But I mean, she was gracious. She was classy. But yeah, I'll never forget her walking on stage and the room being just, I mean, seriously, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, it was just like everybody was just like in awe, like, oh my God, there she is. So that's my memory. I didn't get to talk to her, but I'll never forget that moment. I never saw that with any other guest at the fest.
Amazing.
Well, in other matters, tell us about this Talk More Talk. What are you guys up to? What's upcoming?
Well, we are going to be back on Monday, and we are going to be talking about, each of us are going to pick our 5 favorite Paul McCartney, George Martin collaborations. And we're each going to, we don't know what the others have picked, so we're going to, be surprised. So we're each going to talk about that. And so that's coming up this Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern, right over on our Facebook page. We'll be doing it live. So come on over and share your favorites. We want to.
Good.
Yep, it'll be a lot of fun. We always have a great time with that, and also, and it's the link is on my Facebook page. I was on a local Chicago local show, but you can listen to it online. A show, I love the name. It's a podcast called Gabby Road, and
That's a good one.
I know, I love that.
It is.
Yep, that's a great name, and it's unfortunately talking about another great artist we lost recently, Little Richard. And I talk about it's a short segment, but I talk about the influence of Little Richard on so many artists, including the Beatles, of course. And you can listen to that. That's the archive version of that. That's on my Facebook page. You can check that out. And as always, you can follow me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Kid O'Toole, and you can check out my website at kidotoole.com. And of course, you can check out my books.
I was just going to ask if you had them to hold up.
Yes, I do.
Those are 2 great ones.
Yes, indeed.
Recommend them to the fans. Where can they find them to pick them up?
You can find them at Amazon. That's the easiest way. Just go over to Amazon and look these up, and they will be shipped right to you. Songs We're Singing, Guided Tours through the Beatles' lesser-known tracks, and Michael Jackson FAQ, All That's Left to Know About the King of Pop.
Well, those are 2 excellent books. I've read each one more than once.
Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you.
Oh, wow.
Well, amongst your many talents, will you sing with us if we close out the show at the end?
But of course.
All right. I think you sung this one more than Paul has.
Not as well, but sure.
Excuse me, Bob.
You do it just fine. Yeah.
Excuse me, Bob. Can I ask Kit one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to ask if you've seen the Beatles writer Mark Lewison.
Oh, yeah, Mark Lewison.
Yeah, sorry. He confirmed the news on Twitter to the world.
Yes.
Did you see that? And can you tell me what your thoughts on what he said?
Oh, I mean, yes, I did see that, and I can say I agree wholeheartedly with everything he said. I thought he captured her spirit so well. That absolutely. I'm paraphrasing here, but I know he basically said that she was smart, she was kind and funny. He absolutely encapsulated in however many characters he used on Twitter. Exactly.
Very many.
Very many, and but yes, he did. But he absolutely perfectly summarized who she was and what she was about.
All right, I thank you for that, and sorry for the mispronunciation there.
Oh, no problem. No
sorry,
problem.
Mark. We love to have you on the show, Mark. Sorry. All right, Bob, it's all yours.
All right, let's go singing out. What y'all say? Okay, I'll start us off.
Right.
And in the end,
the love you take
is equal to the love you made.
Bow, 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 bow.